All right, UX Showcase, November. It's already November. Wow. I'm Jeremy Elder. I'm a staff product designer on the foundations team at GitLab, and I wanted to talk about working with layers. So let's see here. I'm gonna go a little more conceptual today. I wanted to show potentially some work on some accessibility audits that were in process for Nav, but just in the back of my mind, this last quarter and a few milestones, there's been a lot of things with foundations and design system. And so I want to share something more conceptual about how I'm thinking about work and specifically from my point of view as a designer in foundations working on the design system. And then at the end, just kind of breeze through a few practical ways where this concept is helping me think about work and doing that. So when I think about working in layers, like I don't mean like in a design tool like in Figma or even layers that are stacking like hierarchically like roles or priority. I'm talking about layers made up of like different kinds of work. And they're layers that aren't necessarily stacked top to bottom, but they're more concentric and they conform to one another and they revolve around a common center. In this case, it's the product. And then these layers also share, because of this uh, concentric quality, they also share the same direction and the same trajectory. So they're revolving around the same center. Outer, but the outer has to move a lot faster to do that. And so these are layers that of work that, excuse me, move together, but they're moving at different speeds. And these layers are called pace layers. And it's not a new concept, but it's layers like features, research, experiments, brand, stage work, product, design system. Like these are where different types of work is happening, and it moves at different speeds. And uh, some of the things I've been thinking about with design system and how can we meet speed when there's features or experiments that are moving more rapidly at a different layer. That's what I wanted to explore and see if I could potentially uh, identify some areas for better collaboration. But pace layers is not a new concept, and so I wanted to back up and give some credit where credit is due. So there's some pace layers. All right, so back in 1994, author Stuart Brand, he wrote a book titled How Buildings Learn: What Happens After They're Built. And to bring his ideas together, he built on an earlier concept called shearing layers. And in the early 1970s, an architect, Frank Duffy, he'd done some analysis on where money gets spent in buildings. And from it, he identified uh, like four different layers of a building that change. There's the shell, the services, the scenery, and the sets. And these are what he called the shearing layers. And he called it that because it was ultimately like layers of the building tearing itself apart, where the outside moves at a different pace, a lot slower than maybe some of the utilities on the inside or the furniture even. And because of this, there was this conflict where buildings were shearing essentially, and most of the cost in the building over 50 years was invested actually in remodeling or additional construction rather than the initial build. And so he noticed that there was some dissonance there. And in Brand's book, he built on that concept with what he called pace layers. So this is where it was, to my knowledge, first introduced. And in regards to a building, it's talking about these layers of shear that he calls pace layers now. And from top to bottom, it's the fastest to the slowest things that change. So the stuff, which is like furniture and decoration, there's the space plan, so rooms in use that might get reconfigured. There's the services, so that could be like plumbing, electricity, ventilation. A building built 100 years ago is going to go through quite a lot of changes with HVAC and other kinds of requirements to get it up to current standards. And then there's the skin, so the aesthetics of the outside, the materials, maybe the site around it, the landscaping. Those things change a little slower. The structure itself is something that is relatively permanent and doesn't change much. And then lastly, the site, what the building is built on. So he created this concept of building and how things move in a system. And that's really why I gravitate towards this, is because it is more system thinking. And ironically, many of the book reviews, about a third, I think is what Brand said, of his book, reference technology and system architecture, because the concept maps so well to it. And that was part of my attraction to pace layers as well, is that the concept really mapped well to any subject matter, and it uses time as kind of a common measurement, something we all experience, to define these relationships. And so it's a really easy concept to overlay. So a little later, in his 1999 book called The Clock of the Long Now, Time and Responsibility, Brand once again built on pace layers, but this time with his what he called a healthy civilization diagram. And so now these layers are not just applied to building, but actually culture. And there's the fashion layer, which changes very frequently. It's very disruptive. There's commerce, there's infrastructure, governance, culture, and then nature. All of these things are moving at different paces. But the caption here, it says the fast layers innovate, the slow layers stabilize, the whole combines learning with continuity. So all of a sudden, there's a shift between shearing and actually layers being complementary. And that's where I think that there's like a really interesting aspect of the work that I do, and recognizing that these are actually layers of different work, but there's opportunities here to be more to bring more continuity and to bring more stabilizing factors in between the layers. So there's something else that Brand stated. I'll just read these two quotes quick. Is that each level is allowed to operate at its own pace, safely sustained by the slower levels below and kept invigorated by the livelier levels above. And each layer must respect the different pace of the others. This sounds a lot like design system work and product work, these different layers being able to operate at their different pace, but sustained and invigorated by one another. And so we have fast layers and we have slow layers. And there's qualities of each, and this is how Brand described the different qualities. He says, fast learns while slow remembers. Fast proposes, slow disposes. Fast absorbs shock, slow integrates shock. Fast is discontinuous, slow is continuous. Fast is innovative and focuses on revolution, but slow focuses on constraints and constancy. Fast gets all the attention and slow has all the power. And so there's this contrast here between the different layers, between the fast and the slow. And so back to the title, working with layers. I want to share like why I'm finding this concept to be valuable, and again, from it, really how I hope to be more intentional in collaborating and exploiting like differences between the layers. Because I think we can all admit that sometimes there's friction when you work with like a design system, and it's like, why is this the way it is, or can we do this, or I'll get to more of those in a minute. So where was I introduced to this concept? So it was from a talk by Mark Bolton a few years back, almost 5 years ago now, or maybe more, that he titled The Fast and Slow of Design. And it was at a Smashing conference, and there's an article posted. I'll link to it in the resources, but the focus was on pace layers and how the concept applied to the tech industry and design systems. And in this talk, he quotes Stuart Brand, who says, the fast parts learn and the slow parts remember. And this is something where it was like a light bulb went off in my mind, understanding now, like I felt like I was like something was illuminated in my mind of understanding design systems in a whole new way, where I didn't I just kind of began to understand that like I didn't have to catch up or feel behind all these other layers of work that were happening. What I needed to focus on was learning, or not the learning, the remembering, in order to help these other parts learn, and in that create more of a stabilizing factor so that these other parts can learn based on other findings. And so, a few questions for you. You don't have to answer here, but this is kind of anecdotally, like, have you ever felt any of the following? Why is it so slow or challenging to get something into the design system? Like, I don't see what I need in the system. Like, can't this be more innovative or interesting? Where can I learn more about it? Or just flat out, like, this isn't efficient at all. Uh, so you might have wondered some of those things. And here's some of the things that I've asked myself that are related, or thought of, like, okay, we're not moving fast enough and things are getting away from us. Or how can we systematize this? How can we stick with a boring solution? Where will someone even look for this? And then ultimately, like, the system should make you more efficient. Uh, and these thoughts and feelings, they were present because the work is happening at different layers and at different speeds, more importantly. And there's something that Stuart Brand calls slippage between the layers, and it's just where there's a disconnect, and you can kind of see that in some of those questioning. But at some point, Brand realized that while slippage occurs, the layers don't have to be shearing, and that's what I've come to realize too. Like, this doesn't have to be like a unhealthy friction; it can be a healthy friction between the layers, uh, and the exact thing that the layers need for the, the exact things the layers need for health and stability and longevity is each other, and that's how I wanted to think about it too. So as an exercise, I wanted to just sit down and create my own product design pace layering diagram. And so from fast to slow, I've listed experiment, product, research, design system, and brand. And the rate of change between these is different. I put brand at the bottom because just from a brand perspective, even though brand continues to change, oftentimes, when we do big rebrands or things like that, that's kind of what I had in mind, where these things happen and then other things cascade from it. But brands aren't typically reinventing themselves. Design systems move a little slower, research slower, and then on up to experiment. So you might put things in different order or even have different layers altogether, and that's fine. It's based on my perspective, which is limited. But it was the adaptability of the concept of pace layers that started to make this a little more palpable for me. And I've also just included internal to external. So design system is more internal focus, but then when we get to experiments and we're testing with users and really validating solutions, those things start to be more external. So there's also this play on the audience here, which I won't really get into beyond that. And so we've seen, like, where layers meet, there's the potential for shearing, and there's some tolerance as like natural slippage occurs. But there's something that's really interesting about these boundaries, and that's where often, like, the most productive collaboration happens. So I have this image here of a wave crashing on a beach, and it's the zone that where this wave is meeting, where there's energy happening, there's sound happening, there's particles mixing in the water, oxygen, and so it's a really interactive and lively area that can produce some pretty interesting results. And that's like the layer between, or not the layer, that's the boundary between our layers, where a lot of things that seem to be maybe at odds are actually areas of productivity. And so, in summarizing this kind of relationship, and there was a presentation uh, by by Stuart Brand and a forecaster and instructor from Stanford University, Paul Sappho, and Mikkel M. He summarized this conversation by saying that relationships between layers are key to the health of the system, And more specifically, as both Stuart and Paul pointed out, conflicts caused by layers moving at different speeds actually kept things balanced and resilient. And Paul called this constructive turbulence. So back to the questions and thoughts from earlier, they're coming from different areas, different layers, and between them, there's indeed like potential for some constructive turbulence. Um, but if we leave these questions unanswered, we'll kind of give in to shearing and dissonance. But if we close the gap between learning and remembering and productive collaboration, uh, between proposing and disposing, innovation and constraints, then we'll get that productive collaboration that will lead to balance and harmony and resiliency across all of our layers. So I want to close with like a few very practical examples of things related to the design system that we've been working on that I believe will help between some of these layers of work and hopefully lead to better collaboration and allow me personally to serve you better uh, and also the work that you do. So first up, again, really practical stuff now is design tooling. And so as I sat down and thought about work, okay, there's a gap between product and design system. There's a boundary here where maybe what's in the design system and design tooling, the UI kit, it's not meeting product needs. And there's all kinds of things that we can address from this. But as an outcome, there's a few things that focusing on. First up, release notes. We've started to publish UI kit release notes, so it's easier to track changes in the design tooling. So we're making this boundary. We're doing something there to supplement it and make that more collaborative and more helpful. We're thinking through component uh, architecture and optimizing for point of use. So you as a designer consuming it rather than point of maintenance, me, the one creating it, making it easy to maintain. That's something that Dan and Katie and others are working through and actively focused on so that we can make sure that when you're using things from Figma and the design tooling, it's going to be better for you to use. And then lastly, for design tooling is design tokens. We're actively working on this, which will help us to codify some of our design decisions and also help synchronize them with development. So really practical, looking at these layers. Okay, here are some things that are happening on the boundaries between these layers. What can we do about it to make it collaborative and to make these things a little more or a little less, maybe is it less or more viscous, more fluid, so that they can work together better. All right, so how about flexibility? This is a big topic because how do you know, like I'm working on an experiment, like do I really need something from the design system? Do I need to kick it back to the design system? I want to try this out. Like what's the relationship there? Like this is a point of like just a known boundary between experiment and design system. And so in recognizing that, wanting to focus on documentation and guidelines to identify like what does it look like to be in the system versus independent? How do we think about our work? How do we know when we should be focusing on one or the other? And so aiming uh, to have some good solutions between those layers to help with that. And then also in regards to flexibility, component abstraction. So looking at componentry and not having such a rigid approach of it, but also knowing that it might need to be extended or used in different ways than maybe what's default in the system, and having an understanding and guidelines for what does that look like and how does that work and how do we adapt and build that in. And then lastly, iteration and compliance. Between design system and research and product, there's a lot of things that happen as we update our UIs where maybe components don't meet needs, or maybe we need to do some design iteration or to track component health or migration readiness. And we need to address these gaps in pajamas documentation to make it easier to do the right thing. And so as part of that, we're taking a look at component lifecycle and seeing like how can we make it more cyclical and meaningful. We're looking at component health. How can we communicate that hey, when you're at the point of migration readiness and whatnot, these components are ready to go, or you as a designer wanting to use a variant, how do you know that I can successfully use that and achieve my goals and it's meeting my goals? So there's a lot of things in here where we need to focus on, and so as by looking at these layers and identifying these areas between kind of these boundaries, these zones of constructive turbulence, able to come up with some solutions to work towards that. And so anyhow, that is pace layers. I hope that I hope that that landed okay. It's kind of an interesting concept, but it's just recognizing that even when we're always shipping, like different work happens at different speeds, and that's a conflict that I had felt for a while. Like why do I feel slower than the rest of design? Why do I feel slower than the product? And then understanding that maybe my role is to be more of that resiliency of uh, remembering. The faster parts are learning, the slower parts are remembering. And by thinking about the work different and the nature of the work differently, looking at those opportunities to make those bounds more continuous and less disruptive. Um, and so, just last point, like what feels like friction can actually become constructive turbulence, and we can leverage that to reduce that disruption and build more continuity between the layers. So again, thank you. And if you want any resources related to this, the talks, articles, books, whatever, here is a QR code. I think it works, and then a link. This, by the way, I'm testing out Arc's new feature where you can share folders and stuff. So that's where this will take you, is just like um, the ability to look at all these links kind of packaged up together. So that is it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. I think it was super interesting thinking about how pace layers apply to product design and sort of the different layer structure there and the speed that things move at. I think it was a really cool perspective. Looks like Amelia, you
Thank you.
have a question if you want to vocalize it.
I do, and apologize if I hope this question makes sense. And I have a really bad head cold, as you can probably hear from my voice. So I'm going to do my best to vocalize it. But you talked a bit about the health of the collaboration between the layers and the like healthy friction and such. But how would you assess the current health of the collaboration between the layers at GitLab? How do you feel like we're doing with that process right now?
Well, you're putting me on the spot. So and I just saw the chat. Like I hope I didn't freeze for too long. Uh Apologies. I was not doing like a pose or anything. I'm really just diverting from your question. So it's a good one. I think it's a mix. I think that the way we work uh, with transparency offsets a lot of this, but where we don't offset a lot of it is documentation or process or requirements, things that help kind of create a common understanding between the types of work. And so, like in the UX Weekly, talking about like issue templates and whatnot, so that we can understand what do we need to do. It's those types of things that I think we can improve on to close some of those gaps. The transparency side, I think we win at every day, and I think that that is awesome. And and honestly, I think that there are areas that could be more healthy, and just to pick on myself, like the way I respond to different things, like that's not in the system, you can't do that, or like why are you doing that? Like I have to be more collaborative in that. And so I think that um there like I have some unhealthy practices that need to be changed and adjusted. And by thinking about the different layers and the nature of work in this way, I can change my mindset to, instead of viewing things as points of friction, to be more helpful and to actually create some solutions in that space. So, uh, at GitLab itself, I think pretty good, but I think there's always going to be room for improvement, and that's why I'm trying to think about this in my own work.
think Becca has another question.
Yeah, so mine kind of plays off of that. Is there anything that comes to mind as a way that the designers doing the stage work, outside of foundations, can help achieve a positive outcome throughout the constructive turbulence? Have you, like, going through this process, have you thought of anything that could be more ideal in that collaboration?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what's interesting is like all of us fit somewhere in a layer. And so there's always going to be like different perspective. I think if I were in like a position of stage work, I would be thinking like if I was to think about pace layers, I would probably be thinking about design systems differently in the sense of not a gosh, Jeremy, like you're making me use this button in this color, and like that's really doesn't fit here, but more about, okay, this is what's in the system. How can we work with it? How can we extend it, build upon it? Like constructively pushing back, but also understanding that the, the a feature of a design system is to be more of that remembering aspect where it balances out uh, some of the other desires to just try everything. It kind of balances that out, counters it. So I would look to say, like, how are these other layers stabilizing the work I do and supporting it rather than like feeling like they might make it less efficient. And also communicating your needs. Like if your needs aren't met with, like, I can't find this information, or this doesn't work as I expected, or this is what I'm really trying to achieve. Communicating that so that we can help fill those gaps. But I think it's interesting too, just how it crosses with other roles with uh, uh, like even research, right? Like some research can take a long form, but we really want to release this today, or work backwards from different timing. And so understanding like what can we do, how can we break things down into smaller bits between product design and research even to get it where we want. So things like that. And then also understanding like what brings continuity versus what is disruptive. Like if from a design system standpoint, I was to say, all right, today everybody, we're switching to dark mode and that's all we're designing in. That would be extremely disruptive because we haven't built the stability in there for you to use. And so it's like an earthquake, that happens at that lower level that shakes things up without like being able to absorb that shock and do that. Or top down, saying, here's our new experiment. This needs to be everywhere in the product, AI, for example. And then, everything under that layer that's moving really fast, like, it's like, wait, how do I catch up? How do I do that? So understanding like, how do we build continuity in these things and understand that the pace of the way some of these things might get integrated into these other layers is going to be different than the pace that we're working in. So sorry, long answer. I'm rambling about this stuff, but good question.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a lot to chew on. I guess it's helpful for us to have this shared language and this model in our brain. So if in the future there is something that I'm working with you regarding the design system or a component, it's a helpful, it's something helpful to refer back to. So I appreciate just like having this concept in our minds, because even though it's kind of theoretical at this point and less tangible, but I think like there will be opportunities in the future where it will become more tangible, and then we'll start to be able to kind of piece it together between the theoretical and the tangible. Yeah, I don't know what words are anymore.
Yeah,
It's
I think that
interesting.
was some of the, maybe the hardest and easiest part about thinking about examples for this is like what is practical about it. And I could even think of like Michael, with your work, maybe how you're using the drawer. And I know I think Becca, we even talked about that back with that, working through that, where it's like, well, this is how we want to use this, and it's not how it's used like today. So how do we realize that we can't just change it overnight in the product, but this is where we want it to be? And so then we work backwards and we focus on documentation or looking at other places where it can be similar, and just realizing that how we want to use it might change the underlying structure of it, and that might take some time. Like as you're learning about this, like we're trying to take that in and remember. And likewise for me, saying, instead of just being like, no, you can't use it like that, like this is it, it'd be more like, okay, you're out here learning, I need to take that and remember like what is happening out here so that I can apply it and make it more useful for you moving forward. So I think it's kind of like this for me, like something practical in the back of my mind. It reframes my questions and how I approach when somebody brings me something that I might initially bristle at or have a negative reaction to. I'm hoping, and I'm not perfect in this by any means, but I'm hoping what it does is allow me to think about, wait a second, okay, they're out here moving at this layer, like they need that. This is closer to our customers, closer to our users. And so what can I do here to uh, to provide stability, but also to learn and grow with that, with the product. So
Yeah, I think the drawer is an interesting example where when some of us were working on AI features, it came up like, oh, it might be helpful if we had a drawer component that you could expand, because at least with explain this vulnerability, there's some code in there that, because the drawer is a fixed width, you'd have to horizontally scroll to see all the code. And so maybe it makes more sense to be able to drag, like resize the drawer. And so I can see that, like now my brain is like, okay, so if we have this theory that resizing the drawer is going to be helpful in some areas, like how do I approach the foundations team with that? What do they say? Like, should we do research on this first, or is that like, it's hard to know, like, do we just make an exception at that higher level, the higher level where like the pace can be faster? Do we just make an exception on this one page with the drawer and go outside of the component specs and just like try it out? Or do we try to integrate that into the component itself, and work with the foundations team on that? But of course, that's going to be a lower level or a more
slower and
level. Yeah. So I still don't know what the answer is, but I think it's good to just like spend some time thinking about that context.
and I don't have an answer for that today, but I can say that that's something that we've all identified. Like I've had probably at least 2 conversations about it, maybe, well, 3 if I count another thread in the last week, like similar, not about the drawer itself or that, but about how does somebody working on something know like when to use a system and not, when to extend it and not. Like some components are extendable, some aren't. Some, if you do, it's inaccessible, some aren't. And so there's like that's one of those boundaries where we have to work on from a foundations team, and create those guides so that we can support that kind of work and look up to those other layers and understand how they're interfacing with the lower, slower moving layers of stability. Like so no perfect answer yet, but stay tuned, because I know that that's on our mind and that's what we want to spend some time working on.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy.